It's a beautiful day in June. I'm Liz Davey, and I thank you for joining me for a walk in the garden on NCTV, Norfolk Community Cable TV. I want to say a thank you to Carolyn in Illinois for her nice card, and I'm glad you enjoy watching the show. We're in the herb garden as usual, and right now, instead of doing much planting, although I'm still doing a little, I'm doing some clipping. The sorrel, which we used a couple months ago to make some soup, is going to seed, and I'm going to trim these off, and hopefully we'll get some nice new leaves on the sorrel. But it starts to go to seed and puts up these large pieces, which we don't need. We don't need more sorrel around the herb garden, so we don't want it to go to seed. Behind me is a rose, and this is a Rose officinalis, which is an old-fashioned rose. It's a once-blooming rose, and I will be, as the blooms fade, I'll be trimming them off. And this rose will get pruned. It didn't get pruned early in the spring, but it gets pruned after it blooms. Any rose that blooms just once during the season is pruned after bloom, and that's what we'll do with this one if I decide I want it a little bit smaller. You don't prune it early or you won't have the early blooms, and since it blooms just once, you want to get all the blooms you can get. This one is particularly fragrant, and the petals can be saved for potpourri and dried. Just bring them in and spread them out on a piece of parchment paper, a cookie sheet, just about anything. Put them in out of the sun and let them dry, and you'll have some very fragrant potpourri for wintertime. Rose petals can also be used as a garnish as long as you don't spray them. They make a lovely garnish. We're going to pick another rose that I have, another once blooming rose, and I'll be doing some candied rose petals a little later in the show. I've been adding a few annual herbs to the garden, and some pots of herbs that I started inside. I have a pot of basil. This is a globe basil, and I also have some scented geraniums that I ordered, and I want to make sure that I keep those well watered. We haven't been getting a whole lot of rain, but we have been getting some, fortunately. I also have a rosemary in a pot and a bay leaf, and again, I want to keep those well hydrated. And up here, a little lemon geranium, and it's pretty small right now. We'll hope it grows a little bit. It's called lemon crispum, and it has a leaf that is a very lemon scent. Again, the scented geraniums are also edible and can be used in food preparation. And the lime balm and lemon balm have expanded greatly. All of the herbs are ready to be used at this point. I have some herbs in here that are not edible, and that would include the valerian, which is blooming up in the back of the garden right now. It has an extremely fragrant bloom, which adds to a flower arrangement that you bring inside. You may have heard of valerian. It is an herbal treatment for depression, I believe, or sleep. I don't use herbal treatments or prepare anything like that, but I do grow a few of the things that can be used medicinally for those who do that sort of thing. But I think valerian is also available as a drug. Many drugs are derived from plants. We'll visit another one a little later. Again, I don't use them for my garden, but I do grow a few, and the valerian I grow simply because it smells so delightful when it blooms. The same with some of the roses. I love to have them in the garden. Here I am over in the perennial garden and next to the grape arbor, and the grapes had a little bit of a slow start, but now they're really going well, and I have a lot of foliage here which needs to be tied up. For ties, I tend to use things like old t-shirts cut in strips, or another good tie for plants is a pair of old pantyhose or dollar store pantyhose cut into strips. They're a little stretchy so that the plant can move a little bit while it's still held in place on the arbor. A lot of things have been in bloom, and we're now starting to cut them off, and we have quite a few things that are starting to bloom. So we're kind of between, but the coral bells have been really pretty this year. I didn't realize I had so many coral bells until they started blooming. Usually it's just a nice little foliage plant, but once a year they put on quite a nice bloom, and they'll continue to bloom sporadically after this. But they're just a lot of little pink blooms. Many of the coral bells are foliage plants that grow in shade or part shade and have different colors of foliage. I have some that are almost orange and others that are dark. So you can find coral bells, but the ones that bloom and have the brighter blooms tend to like full sun. The lilies are starting to bloom, and this year we haven't had too much of a problem with lily beetles. A little bit, but not enough really to worry about it too much. I mean, we still have great foliage, and they're starting to come out. I've squished a few beetles, but not very many. So the natural predator that was released in Rhode Island a number of years ago seems to be working in decreasing lily beetles, which is nice because lilies are a nice addition to the garden, and a lot of people just stopped growing them completely because they could not deal with the lily beetles. I have foxgloves, and that's another plant. Digitalis, a heart drug, is derived from foxgloves. That makes it a plant that is toxic, so if you have children or pets that eat plants, you probably don't want to grow them. My foxgloves tend to reseed wherever they wish, and this one in front is not really where I would have chosen to plant it. However, it reseeded itself there, and I really didn't want to move it because it was such a lovely plant. Behind that, I've had plants that need to be cut back, and we're cutting back things as they finish blooming. So we've cut these back, and we'll let the foxgloves take the glory for a while. Instead of letting these, deadheading these, which is cutting off the blooming stalks, I will want these to reseed. Foxgloves are a very sporadic plant. They will probably be biennial and may not come up next year. They came up a little bit last year, they bloom this year, and then they die. So I want to make sure that I collect seeds from these and maybe spread them in back where I'd rather have the foxgloves grow because they are a tall plant. They bloom from the base up, and I'll just let these make seed, and then we'll spread the seed where we'd like it to grow for another year. And 2 years from now, we should have more blooms from these plants. You'll notice the bumblebees. I don't know if the camera can see them, but there's bumblebees on the plants, and they go right inside. It's fun to watch them as they go right inside the little bells of the plant. They love the foxgloves. More lilies will come later, and these are a coneflower, and they too will be blooming later on. The dark plant is Eupatorium chocolate, and it will be blooming into the fall. It has just a white bloom, but its foliage is very distinctive and adds a lot of color right now, just as foliage. I've had some rabbit damage on some of my coneflowers back here. They sneak in from out in the field, and but it hasn't been too bad, and not bad enough that I want to put a cage around the plant. This plant, the yellow plant, is called Phlomas, and my plant is declining a little bit. I used to have several larger blooms. Again, each year is different in the garden. Some years this blooms with tall stems, and the Perennial Geranium, this is Brookside Perennial Geranium, that will be shorter this year. It's taller. The Phlomas is shorter. This is a fun plant because it has blooms in layers, and it also comes in a pink variety. One of the coneflowers kind of snuck in between the Phlomas and the geranium, and it's in bloom, and the rabbits haven't found it, fortunately. So I will get some nice pink blooms from that. This is Boltonia. It's already bloomed in blue. It's a kind of a pea type relative, and these are the finished blooms. It's going to seed. I don't want any more Boltonia in this garden. I don't want it spreading all over, so I'm going to go through and take all of these seeds off the plant so that it won't spread. I can add these empty pods to the compost pile. They haven't made seed yet, so I can keep adding those. This plant in front is called Nectar Garlic. It has a number of names, and they keep changing it. It has been blooming with bells. It was pink and purple bells that bloomed earlier, and again, this is in the process of drying. And once it's dried, I will cut off these stems. And I may save them for dried arrangements in the fall. We'll see what they look like when it comes out. Filipendia is another plant that's finished and will be cut off. It's white blooms and a little ferny foliage, and the ferny foliage will stay and add just a little background to the garden. As you can see, I have bulbs that are starting to brown. I leave them. I will have spaces. Once they are brown, we'll take them out. But they need to do that. They need to naturally turn brown after the bulbs have bloomed. This gives strength to the bulb, and they need the strength in order to have flowers next year. So the daffodils are a bit of a pain because they do take quite a while to die back. The tulips have all pretty much disappeared or been disappeared because they turned brown and were easily pulled. You don't want to pull these until they come out very easily, and you'll know when to do it when they're completely brown. Again, this whole area will be a little vacant, and that's when I'll put some plants that I'm growing, annual plants, in pots in to fill the spaces. I have grasses back here that are growing, and now I'm going to go down a little further down in the garden. We'll stop right here. And one thing you can do to some of the perennials now is what they call a Chelsea chop, and that comes from England, and you cut them in half. This is a goldenrod, and there's a nice phlox behind it that doesn't show. So I'm going to just cut these down by about a third, and hopefully they will branch out and they'll bloom a bit later than they normally would, which is all right, and we'll be able to see the phlox. So this would be called the Chelsea chop, and you can do this to some of the other plants as well. You can probably do it to the phlox, but I'm wanting to have the phlox bloom. But this will continue to bloom, and we have another plant at this point. And this is a phlox. Now, if you have phlox and have had trouble with mildew, this is the time before it starts to use a product, and this is called Serenade. There are other mildew products, and you want to just give it a spray with that. Any plant that's prone to mildew, that would be asters and phlox primarily. These are asters in front, and I don't have too much problem with mildew on those. The mildew is the white coating that forms on squash and flowers, and I'm not sure the resistance. You can buy resistant phlox at this point, something to look for, especially if you've had problems with mildew in the past. The other thing with the phlox is you want to keep air circulating around it. And if it's very dense, this one is not as dense yet, but if you have a phlox that's become extremely dense, and even the asters down here that are dense, I may want to cut out about every third or fourth one so that air can circulate around them. And this helps prevent the phlox or the mildew from growing on the phlox and the asters. These are Siberian Iris, which were white and have gone by. And now I need to remove the seed pods, unless I want them to grow and save them for fall decorations. The seed pods can be painted. Gold is nice. I will probably save a few. Again, I don't really want them to reseed, so I'll be cutting those off. Another one that I'll be saving is poppies. These were lovely pink poppies, about the same color as the coral bells underneath them, and they are going to be turning brown and curing, forming seeds. There'll be seeds inside them, but once they're brown, I'll cut these off and again save them for fall arrangements. You can save quite a few things and dry them and then have fall arrangements from them. Further down, I have more daffodils and more lilies ready to go, and this is butterfly weed, and butterfly weed will draw in the monarch butterflies. It's a very good native plant, native to this area, and I have several clumps of it that I grew from seed, and it'll be a bright orange circle here in the garden. Not very good color planting necessarily with the pink rose, but it seems that all colors kind of blend when they're flowers. This pink rose is a knockout rose, and it's as the blooms fade, I will deadhead each one because we're going to get continued bloom on this rose. The first flush of bloom that we're seeing now in June is probably the heaviest bloom all season, but it will continue to put out sporadic blooms. And after this flush of bloom is completed, I want to add another dose of fertilizer, and I use a organic rose fertilizer. And the other thing to remember is to keep it watered. Roses need about 5 gallons of water per week. That would translate to an inch of rain. We haven't been getting it. So supplemental water for your roses is pretty much needed right now. I have several peonies in the garden, and they've gone by, and we'll be deadheading those. I hate to see them go. They didn't last too long with the heat this year, but it's time. And this too will need a little extra fertilizer now that they're gone, and we deadheaded these back. Got a couple that still have some color, so we'll leave those and wait until they're pretty much completely gone. Again, more bulb foliage that will need to die back. Then we can add some annuals. I have planted zinnias in my vegetable garden and some other plants, and those can be divided or thinned because they're too close together right now. So I'll be thinning those out, putting them in some pots, and we can put a few of those in the perennial garden just as annuals to brighten things up a little bit later on. I've been filling my hummingbird feeder regularly with supplemental food for the hummingbirds. The hummingbirds have been very prevalent this year. I've seen them on a lot of the plants, which is always nice. And also, I've had to fill my hummingbird feeder a little more often this year, so they must be consuming them. Chrysanthemums are generally a perennial plant, but people usually plant them in the fall, and they don't make it through the winter. And these I'm taking about 1/2 inch off the top of each of the stems, and this will cause the plant to branch out and not become tall and leggy. Many times if you keep the chrysanthemum over the winter, if it happens to live, it will get too tall and leggy and fall over. By thinning them, this one's been here, probably 5 years. I planted it in the spring, and that is the key. If you buy your chrysanthemums and the local garden centers do not carry them, you have to order them from one of the plant places. And then you pinch them back. It's called pinching. And you pinch them back on 4 holidays: Memorial Day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, and 4th of July. And then you stop pinching them on the 4th of July. That's the last pinch, or thereabouts. I mean, the day before or the day after is fine. But you stop pinching them on 4th of July, and then they will form buds, and you'll have your chrysanthemums in the fall. I have some just common daisies here, and they tend to get very tall and rangy and kind of fall all over everything. I love them. They add a lot of color. But once they're gone, I will cut the whole plant back to almost ground level. And that clears the space for some of the other things that are in this area: daylilies, phlox, sedum, Shasta daisies, and lavender. So that one will get cut back before we do another show. Here's another poppy. This one is Patty's Plum, which was plum colored. And I will probably cut these back rather than trying to save the seed pods, because Patty's Plum sometimes will bloom again. And I would like to have another plum colored poppy here. I have more peonies, and again, they need to be cut back as time goes by. And this is a little sedum. It's called Grateful, I think. And I didn't realize how short it was when I planted it, but it adds a little white back in the color. Now this peony has some other buds on it, so it will continue to bloom, and we'll have some further bloom on this after we deadhead these. This is Monarda, or butterfly weed. This is a tall version. It'll be red in another month. And down here we have lady's mantle, which sometimes is called an herb. Can be found in some herb gardens. It's a pretty little plant. I like the flowers on it. Nice addition to a floral arrangement. Nice background. The little kind of lime colored blooms. Not real colorful, but it does add to an arrangement as background. I have several perennial geraniums, and they're not related much to the geraniums that you can buy at the garden center and put in your flower garden or your annual baskets. But they do add a lot of color, and they tend to spread quite a bit. In fact, a little too much on this one. It will need to be reined in a little bit before next year. Moving down this way, I have another Monarda. This is Monarda bred Burria, and it's a more native plant. All Monardas are native and are very, very popular with the butterflies. This one blooms extremely early and stays short. And it doesn't spread quite as much as the regular Monarda does, which will spread all over the garden if you give it a chance, and don't deadhead it. But these tend to stay in a nice little clump, and I really like the plant with its little purplish pink blossoms that last quite a while. And then the actual flower center will stay kind of cute and kind of a little button on the plant through fall. Again, you can use it in floral arrangements when it's dried. I tend to leave them on the plant. It doesn't seem to spread like your regular Monarda. Strawberry patch has been bearing beautifully. The only problem I've had so far are that the chipmunks can get in. They do come in and help themselves, but we've had plenty. And I should be able to pick even more today. I've covered them with netting, and I've found this netting works about as well as any. And gives me some stump berries, but I'll come through and pick and have some really beautiful berries from this patch. This is their second year. Last year I planted them and removed all of the blossoms. That's hard to do when you know you would get some berries, but you see they expanded and really took. And this year we've been getting 2 and 3 and sometimes 4 quarts every other day. So lots of berries. I've put some in the freezers. I've given some away to family members, and it's been a good crop. Raspberries are starting to put on berries. I'll be putting a net over those. We have birds and chipmunks who like berries about as much as I do. The chipmunks are the ones that bother the strawberries the most. The net helps some, but they can get under it. They're tricky little fellows, and we seem to have a lot of them this year. But I'm still getting plenty of berries, so I guess it's okay to share. The netting I use is green nylon net that I buy at a fabric store. It tends to be less expensive, and it's a little finer than the netting that they sell for netting berries, which is maybe 1/4 to 1/2 inch, and this is a very fine net. It's also quite inexpensive, or at least it used to be, and works really well for the berries. It tends to be very wide as well. It'll cover my 2 rows, and I don't know how many. You have to measure to find out how many yards you're going to need, but it works well. It's not too obtrusive in the garden. The onion sets that we put in earlier are now being harvested, and I'm trying to kind of thin them out as I go. Those that are left will make onions. So we'll have plenty of onions, but we have plenty of scallions right now. Throughout the garden I have some things that volunteered, cilantro and dill mainly, And I leave some of it. I don't leave all of it, but we've picked cilantro and dill to use in the kitchen. And I've put up my net for the peas. And I have 3 kinds of peas here that are in blossom. And hopefully by 4th of July, we'll be able to eat peas. The next thing, I'm going to come around the edge and bring my clippers. We have radishes here too that are large and lovely. We've been able to pick. We've got some nice radishes and spinach, arugula, lettuce, and there's a few flowers mixed in here and there that I let grow, and I put some extras at the end of the rows, little marigolds for later. But these are the garlic plants. And garlic, this is hardneck garlic, which grows a scape. And these are the scapes, and you need to cut those off. This will force the plant, instead of trying to go to seed, to form a larger garlic bulb, which is what you want. Fortunately, these are also useful. You can just cook with them. You can slice them up and use them like onions, or you can put them in the food processor and make pesto to freeze or to use. You can make other things with them. They are useful. They're mild garlic flavor. And they're sold in farmers markets. You'll see them being sold right now too in many of the farmers markets, because they too have to cut down on their garlic. I've got a basket here someplace. I have kale and old parsley, plants that are starting to go to seed. I'm still using that parsley. Again, a row of flowers. I like to put flowers in my vegetable garden. They just add a little color, and it's nice to have when you're working in the garden, something like that. And we have plenty of Brussels sprouts, Piracicaba, which is a broccoli relative. It's like broccolini if you buy broccolini at the store, and it grows quite well. And I also have broccoli plants, and as I said, Brussels sprouts. So all of these cole crops, I have to watch that. We may see a little white butterfly fly through. That's a cabbage moth, and that's what's responsible for those green worms that you find in the cabbage and broccoli. If it starts to get prevalent, that I see a lot of those little white moths, I will spray with an organic spray that helps with that. It's spinosad, and it is approved for organic use, and I will use some of that. I have a few eggplants and peppers, and I have spotty luck with peppers and eggplant, but I always try a few to see how they'll come through. I planted dill, cilantro, and I have little teeny parsley over on the other side, along by the beans. And once the parsley has gone to seed, the parsley from last year, this parsley will take over, and it will provide me with parsley today, or this year, and then an early start to the next season. This is my cucumbers, and I have 2 different kinds. I have some regular slicing cucumbers and also some picklers. And what I do is I make a teepee. I put a string around the bottom, and then I'm going to run around all the way around this. I've done one side already, and just put strings up and loop them over the top. And the cucumber will climb this. They aren't quite ready to climb yet, which is just when you want to put the strings up so that they'll have them when they're ready. And when you have the time. And we'll just keep going around and around and tie it off at the end. And move these Probably put 5 or 6 pieces. I've planted them fairly close together. Keep going around. And keep them spread out a bit. And so forth until we're completely finished with the teepee. Then I'll do the same thing on the other one, and I'll be ready to have the cucumbers climb. By getting them to climb instead of sprawling all over the ground, they'll be a little easier to pick, and they won't cover up my other crops. I didn't have to leave quite as much room for the cucumbers. I always have more crops than I have space. Even though I have a good-sized garden, I could plant more. More flowers, more vegetables, always room for something else. Now, I think we're ready to move into the shade garden. Like the rest of my gardens, the shade garden has been really growing. And the little rain that we've had has really spurred bloom. The hellebores provided bloom for about 2 months, but they're finished. And now I want to trim those back, the blooms. They do go to seed, and you'll get more hellebores. If you've only got one, let them go to seed. But I have a lot of them, and so I don't want any more. And I already have seedlings from past years, so I'm going to cut the blooms and just leave the foliage. Remember, we cut the foliage on this plant, on these plants in the spring, and the new foliage is what we're seeing. The old foliage, if you didn't get around to taking the old foliage off, you'll have old foliage as well as the new foliage, and you want to take that off too. It's just messy. It doesn't hurt anything, but it is quite messy. But since I don't want any more, I'm just going to cut these blooms off, all of them. Now these I will not put in the compost. Hellebores are a toxic plant, and I will either put these in the trash or in an area that I'm not going to use compost from. In the back of my property I have what I would refer to as long-term compost. In other words, it just stays there and spreads out and decomposes. And I can put these there. But they look a lot better when you get the old blooms off. And you don't have to worry about taking them off in the fall. There's some bulb foliage in here as well. And the hostas have taken over. These I want to make sure get enough water and maybe a little extra fertilizer. For my hostas, I use tomato fertilizer. It tends to have the nitrogen that they need, and it works really well. I read about it in one of my books and have used it, and it's been a good fit. I have ferns in this garden. I've planted a few, and a few have just grown, and I've let them stay. Tiarella is the little white bloom down in the middle, and there's also some epimedium, which is the little heart-shaped leaves, and I have that in a few places in a few different kinds. It had the little fairy flowers back in April, and they just kind of disappear. You don't even need to take those off. But the plant stays, and it makes a lovely little ground cover that just spreads very slowly. It doesn't become a thug like some of the ground covers I have. Unfortunately, I planted a lot of myrtle, or vinca, if you call it that, and pachysandra. These are both non-natives, and they have spread, and they sometimes get too much. In fact, they're covering up a few paths in places and will need to be weeded out. Those too will not get compost. What I'll do with the ground covers that I weed out will be to put them in a black plastic garbage bag, set them in the sun, and let them solarize, which means they will quickly turn brown and decompose. Instead of putting the decomposed material into my compost, I will either burn it or take it to the landfill, or dump, or put it in the trash, whichever option you have. Again, if you leave pieces of that in your compost, you're just going to continue having it grow. So you want to get it out of your property completely. I have several kinds of ferns, as I said. Some of my favorites are the Japanese ferns, and they're colorful. They are gray or white, or sometimes quite red and burgundy. Where I've had bulbs, I've put in some annuals here and there that I grew inside from cuttings. Mainly coleus, which grows well in the shade. Do have to watch that for slug damage. So I use some of the slug iron pellets around it to help prevent it getting chewed up completely. The last time we were here, my pond was pretty murky, and now it's pretty clear. I have not changed the water. I have been using the enzyme treatments that are a natural way of clearing the water, and I do have the skimmer, which I do clean the skimmer basket and a pad that I put in the skimmer, mesh or spongy type material that I wash frequently, and it starts to clear up. I'm going to feed the fish, see if they'll come over, and here they come. I have 6 fish, which is enough for this size pond. If you get too many fish, you have some water problems because of fish waste. The other thing I need in the shade garden, of course, is my deer spray, and I'll be going around and spraying my hostas. We haven't had too many deer this year sighted, but I know they're there, so I do try to keep my hostas, especially those along edges, sprayed with the deer spray. Again, I will be adding, I added my plants that were inside over the winter to the back. They're elephant ears, and I'm hearing frogs croaking in the background. They're out hunting today. Usually there's 2 or 3 around on the pond. Later, there's one in one of the plants right now, but I'm hearing them out hunting and talking to us. At any rate, the plants that I put in were inside over the winter, and quite frankly, I'm able to keep them alive over the winter. That's about it. But once they get out here, and I have to wait until nights are higher than 50 degrees to put them out, I put fertilizer tablets in them at least once a month, and they will take off, and we'll see some leaves in another month or so. They're starting to put up new leaves now, and they will get quite large by the end of the season if I keep fertilizing them. Once they sit in the water, they get adequate water and fertilizer, and they take off. They are a bulb, and usually, right now I have 4 of them. The one that's the least hardy by the end of the season probably will get dumped, and a new one will be added next year, so that I keep 3 or 4. The iris stays in the pond all season, and it is a yellow iris, and it seems to like the water. I will take the blossoms off of that one. That one tends to be an invader, an invasive type of iris. It likes the shade, it likes the water. We have wetland nearby. I don't want it to spread in the wetland, so I make sure that I take off any blooms. Once its bloom is finished, I will make sure I take it off so it does not go to seed. Otherwise, we'll have a problem with it. I would not plant it again. I would plant another type that was not invasive, but this one was planted a number of years ago, so I leave it there for now, but am careful with it. Again, I enjoy sitting out here. It's shady, it's comfortable, and we have fun just enjoying it. This is a begonia, and this is its 3rd year. I took it inside in the winter. It cut it off, put it in a cool bedroom, brought it out this spring, started watering it, and there it is. I didn't even repot it. I just gave it a little fertilizer and a little water, and off it goes. It is a bulb, and this is one plant, and it completely fills the basket. Ferns, I have plenty of ferns. I may transplant a few. They're getting a little invasive, and ferns can be invasive, but don't hesitate to just pull them out. They pull out quite easily. Right now we have a bit of mountain laurel blooming, and you can see one of the blooms in here. We've got quite a few new pieces of growth on this particular bush, unless, unfortunately, a tree was dropped on this bush and did considerable damage a few years ago. It's coming back slowly, but we're not getting the blooms that we once did. We've got 3 or 4 blooms, but I'm looking forward to the day when it's covered in this area. And it probably will be. The rhododendron behind it bloomed quite well this season. And by the way, you can take the blooms off rhododendrons if you wish. You can deadhead them now, and it's time to trim your rhododendrons and azaleas. Once they've finished blooming, again, is the time to trim them back. Then they will form you can see them start to form their buds for next year's bloom. You don't want to wait too late. Fall is way too late to prune back your azaleas and rhododendrons if you want blooms next year. This is part of the shade garden, though right now it does get some sun. And right now the goat's beard is blooming, and the astilbe is just about ready to bloom. And so it's kind of a full of plumes area, along with some ferns, some large ferns and hosta. The goat's beard right now is absolutely covered with pollinators, which is very good. I grow a lot of things that I want the pollinators. They help with all the vegetables and the flowers, and the goat's beard seems to be attracting many of them today. As you can see, they're flying around pretty good all over it. Different types of native pollinators, and those are the ones we want. There'll probably be some honeybees there too. Someone in the area, I believe, has some hives that their bees travel in my direction at times. But these are a native type bee that's on them today. And I have quite a bit of it. And the reason I have quite a bit is because once it's finished, it goes to seed. And it comes up wherever. And so once it's finished, I want to make sure again to deadhead this and get those plumes that it will turn brown and get them off and discard them before it has a chance to completely fill the area with goat's beard. I like the plant, but not entirely covering my property. So I want to make sure that I get the plumes off so I don't have it all over the lawn and everything else. A trick, if you have people coming to visit and you haven't weeded your gardens, is to weed the edge. If you can't do the whole thing, just do the edge, and it will look a lot better. And it will look as if you've handled the whole garden. You can do the whole thing later. But these will be white plumes that will last quite a while. With the astilbe, I have some that's red further up, but this area is kind of green and white all season, which I like. Now it's time to go inside and do some cooking. Now today in the kitchen I'm going to prepare a meal. This is a meal for 2 or maybe 3, but by doubling or tripling the recipes, it might be a good recipe or a good menu for Father's Day. I'm making spare ribs, and my recipe for spare ribs is a little different because what I do is I par cook them, and I put them in this pan, and they're cooked for an hour. Don't add anything to them, just cover them tightly with foil and put them in the oven for 1 hour, and then pour off any liquid that accumulates. That gets rid of a lot of the fat, which tends to burn when you put the spare ribs on the grill if you start with raw meat. Then I'm going to make a barbecue sauce to go on them, and for that I'm going to cook that on the stove. You can make the spare ribs up, ahead of time, which I did, and then we're going to finish them on the grill, which doesn't take more than about 10-15 minutes. But I'm going to start with 1.25 cups of ketchup and 2 tablespoons of brown mustard, spicy brown mustard, 2 tablespoons of brown sugar, 3 tablespoons of water, a teaspoon of garlic powder or onion powder, your choice. I'm using garlic powder. Move some things over here. And some hot sauce. And I'm going to put in, I said 1/4 teaspoon. We tend to like a little heat, so I'll probably add more like a teaspoon of hot sauce. And that is going to get stirred together, and we're going to cook that and simmer it for about 15-20 minutes. The next thing I'm going to make, is a potato salad. And I'm going to start out with cooked potatoes, and these are the little yellow golden potatoes, the new potatoes that I've cut in half and boiled, and it took about 10 minutes, 15 minutes just to do that. And then I'll use some of the things from my garden. Some chopped parsley, and chopped scallions, chopped radishes, little chopped dill, and though I've planted celery in my garden, it isn't ready yet, so I've used purchased celery that's been chopped up. And then we need to make a dressing for this potato salad. And for that, I'm going to make a buttermilk dressing. And I'll use 1/2 cup of buttermilk. And we're going to turn that way down because it's starting to bubble. One-1/4 cup of sour cream. This also makes a good dressing for lettuce, and you can add herbs to it. Because I've added the herbs to the potatoes, I'm not going to add the herbs now to the dressing. And 2 tablespoons of mayonnaise. So it's buttermilk, sour cream, and mayonnaise. And I'm going to save that out. And we want to add a tablespoon of lemon juice as well. And a little salt and pepper. Again, that's kind of an individual taste. I'm using white pepper. And then I'm going to whisk those together. Then I'll add some of that to my potato salad. I may not use all of it because I have quite a bit. And we'll mix that in and mix all the vegetables around. And we may add it all. You could also use just plain mayonnaise, which is more traditional, but this is kind of a nice change. I'll put a little garnish on, radish rose and little parsley, maybe 2 radish roses. I've got 2 that I made. Radish roses are very easy. You just kind of peel with a knife down the sides and put them in a cold water or the refrigerator, and they open up to make a little flower. Makes a nice little easy garnish. And our potato salad will be ready to go on the table. What I've done is fill, oops, they fell down. I guess I can't tip it up to show you. But I cut a piece off of the bottom of each of these Savoiardi biscuits. These are Italian ladyfingers that are crisp. Most ladyfingers are soft, the American ones, but the Italian ones tend to be crisp. And these are available in the grocery store. So this makes it easy. You don't have to bake anything. This is totally refrigerated. And the piece that I cut off, I stuck in the bottom of the pan to form a base. The original recipe said just to cut them off and then use whole ones in the base, but I couldn't see wasting the little pieces, so I just put those in the bottom. And then we'll make a filling for that. And I have the strawberries out from my garden, and the recipe calls for adding a teaspoon of balsamic vinegar to the strawberries instead of sugar, which is normally what one would add to that. This causes them to juice, but not as much as sugar would. You don't want too much juice in the berries. So those are ready, and then we will make the filling. And the filling is pretty simple. It's 1 8-ounce package, 1 cup of mascarpone cheese. Possibly could use a light cream cheese instead, but this is the Italian version, and it goes with our Italian ladyfingers. So we're going to add that in. I have that already in my bowl, and to that I'll add a 1/4 cup of sugar and a teaspoon of vanilla. I didn't get all my sugar out of the cup. There we are. And then I'm going to mix it with my mixer. And again, I chose a larger container. And then I want to add 1 cup of cream. You could double this to make a 9-inch cake. And I'm adding a cup of heavy cream. And we're going to mix this well. And now we have stiff peaks, which is just what we want. And I'm going to put about half the mixture into the middle of the ladyfingers. And spread it around. This will further hold them in place. And then we'll add about half the strawberries. And I'm using a slotted spoon so that any juice stays in the bottom. A little piece of strawberry hull. The rest of my filling. At this point, if you wish, you can put it in the refrigerator right now without adding the berries, but I'm going to add the berries. Anyway, it's not going to hurt it at all to have the berries added. And a little more of the cream to spread on. And I'll add another layer of berries on top. If you wanted to be fancy, you could arrange these and use whole berries on the top. But I'm just putting them on at this point, and I'll spread them out a little bit to cover the top with strawberries. Now this is going to go in the refrigerator for probably at least 8 hours, and overnight is even better. This is your dessert, and it's all solidified and ready to be cut into pieces. One more thing I want to do, and that is, if you remember, we candied some rose petals back in, or violets. And today I want to candy some rose petals. And the rose that I mentioned, I like the rose. It suckers badly. It blooms just once. And most people probably wouldn't even have it in their garden. But I love the rose because of its petals, which are a multitude, and many of them are heart-shaped. It also smells delightful. So I keep the rose, and I'm going to sugar the roses. And for that, I do use, instead of an egg white, I make up the equivalent of an egg white with meringue powder, which is safer to use. It is a pasteurized product. And I'm using a little brush to coat each rose petal, back and front. It's a picky job, and then I use the ultra light or ultra fine sugar, and I will coat the petal with the sugar and let them dry on a piece of wax paper. The ones I did earlier are already dry. It doesn't take long at all. These make a great garnish. They can be kept in a tin in the freezer between layers of wax paper, and they'll last at least a year, possibly longer. We've cooked our barbecue sauce. We're going to have plenty here. We'll have enough for not only serving our spare ribs, but probably for use on other barbecued menus, and I'll pour some of the sauce on them. These will go on the grill. We can baste them with sauce. I'll put the rest in the pan, and we'll baste them with the sauce, and then we'll serve them with what I put in the dish. And we'll put this out in front and put our flower arrangement over. And these are just a mixture of the things I was able to pick from my garden. Peonies, valerian, a few roses, a few of the coral bells, and some of the bloom stalks from the lovage, which is now also going to seed. So I thank you for joining me today. I'm Liz Davey, and you've been watching A Walk in the Garden on NCTV, Norfolk Community Cable Station.